Hi folks, this video is about the Netflix series The Good Place. Let me say, I'm not going to examine all of the philosophical themes in this series, in part because there's so much philosophy in it. And a lot of that philosophy has to do with ethics and moral theory, such as the various assessments of characters' actions. Instead, what I'm going to examine is the existential plight of each of the characters and the various forms of despair that they find themselves in. For example, here are some of the folks I'll talk about. Eleanor Shellstrop from Phoenix, Arizona, who sells pills to defraud the elderly with no regret whatsoever. If I had to compare her to the characters in Sartre's play, I would say she is the Aine character, not just because she's aware of how wicked she is, she's selfish and she knows it, but also because the Aine character in Sartre's play expresses the most profound insights and sees through their situation in a deeper way than anybody else. And that is exactly what Eleanor does. And this is a key part of her character, as we'll see later on in the series. We also mainly see the action through Eleanor's eyes. So she is the main protagonist. And that's a way in which, even though she's so selfish and deeply flawed, we have a lot of sympathy for her, the way in which the action is depicted. Okay, so who's next? Chidi. This is Eleanor's ostensible soulmate, the philosophy professor from Senegal, who's a specialist in ethical and moral philosophy. So he is like the ethical center of the film, especially of this collection of humans that find themselves together. We'll see later on that he has his own problems, but nonetheless, we don't learn that until much later in season one, and we only start to learn it gradually. So his view is oftentimes the view of objective reason. If I had to compare him to Sartre's play, I would say he's most like the Garcin character for a couple of reasons. One thing is, as we learn later on about him, he faces the burden of choice. He is condemned by freedom in a very similar way to Garcin. And the other thing is too, you know, he has to start helping Eleanor. He's stuck in this cobweb with her, but he doesn't want any part of it. He'd rather not have to deal with all that baggage of the other character's moral failures, and would rather flee from it. So I think there's many ways in which he is like Garcin in Sartre's play. Next, Tahani, she is the next door neighbor, and we also don't learn her moral flaws until far along in the series. But you can already tell by some of her actions. Yes, this is through Eleanor's perspective, but there's also a lot of truth to it. That Tahani seems condescending. She has this supercilious attitude. She's a lot like the Estelle character, actually. She needs acknowledgement. She seeks the eyes of others and the way in which she is buoyed in social status by comparing herself to others. So I think there's many ways in which she is the young socialite, just like Estelle. Now, there's another character, Jason, Jason Mendoza from Florida, who's an amateur DJ and drug dealer. I don't think he has any kind of analog in Sartre. So the makers of this show threw him in there. He's a bit of a wild card and is really an important character for adding depth to this group. I think he is essential for rounding out this ensemble in various ways. And when we start to talk about the forms of despair that all the characters are engaged in, we'll see more about the kind of role that he plays. He's known originally not as Jason, but as Jianyu, as the Buddhist monk who has taken a vow of silence. So we'll say more about his situation in a minute. Now, I think there's the valet character from Sartre is here too, but really it's split between Michael and Janet. So Michael is the architect of the good place. In some sense, he's the archangel Michael from Christianity, but we learn later on, actually, he's just a lower level demon. He's not devil. He's not high up in the satanic order. He's just a total minion in the bureaucracy of the underworld, or in the afterlife, in this fictional universe. So he is like part of the valet character. The other part is Janet, who is sort of like this living Alexa, this character who can perform the key informational functions for everybody and actually gets enmeshed in the lives of the humans, even though she's not a human. and she'll play an important role in their salvation or their quest for meaning. But she works a lot like the valet too. Part of the reason the show works so well is the way in which Michael and Janet are split apart in their roles, and they both provide a kind of authority figure, but in very different ways. Now, the fundamental premise of The Good Place is that everybody has died, and they have these like ethical points, this value and numerical assessment of how good they were on Earth. And at first, it seems like Eleanor is the one outlier. She's the person who doesn't belong here, and that's what pains her so much, and how she feels so much anguish in the show. That's her crisis, her inner crisis. But what we later see, actually, one at a time, we see that the other characters have deep flaws too. They are implicated in this. And, we first see it about Jason, and then we learned it about Chidi and Tahani as well, that each of them has a deep sort of flaw. Each of them is actually in existential despair, or that's what I'm going to try to convince you next. So let's talk about Eleanor first. She's the one who says, like, I am the selfish ass. She is plagued by guilt, and she is full of anguish because she says, I'm surrounded by people that are better than me. And whenever that happens, she tries to tear them down. And what she's doing there is she's covering up her own deep insecurities. I think this shows that she actually has a sense of morality. So I would not put her in the Kierkegaardian or Dostoevskian universe. I would not say she has no self. She actually does have a moral center, even though you might not realize it, but it's deeply repressed. I think in Dostoevsky's universe, she is actually quite a lot like Fyodor. She is the sensualist. She is the purely selfish person. She'll ditch her friends. In one of the episodes, we see her ditch her friends. They're out for cocktails after work just because she wants to hook up with the bartender. She'll act in completely selfish ways, following her own passions and indulgence. This is precisely the way Fyodor would act. So they both have a sense of morality, although it's deeply buried. Now, what we'll see, though, is that we'll see her morality come out actually in another way, too, because she's better fit for salvation than Fyodor, although we'll learn this later on. Now, one thing that I think is really hilarious is there's this one episode in which Chidi and Eleanor are at a party, and he asks her, okay, just tell me something you did well, to try to justify him helping her survive and be a member of the Good Place. She can't think of anything. This is the way in which she is so selfish. She is seemingly beyond hope. When she's trying to think of something, she thinks of this episode. This is actually her attempt at just coming up with a neutral event. This guy asks her, like standing outside the supermarket, do you have a second for the environment? And she throws her coffee cup her Starbucks cup at his feet and says, do you have a second to eat my farts? That's the best that she can do. So in Dostoevsky's universe, she didn't even give an onion. That's how beyond salvation she is. But this is what's so interesting about the series, is she didn't give an onion in her lifetime. That is true. But she's dead, but she's not gone. And maybe she can learn to give an onion in the afterlife. And there is a route to Dostoevskian salvation here, nonetheless. Okay, we're still talking about the state of despair that she finds herself in, though, throughout most of season 1. Now let's talk about Chidi. I think Chidi is actually in a deeply kind of despair. He's a deeply Sartrean character. He, as Eleanor says, you're the tortured academic. He's like a human stomachache. Every time he has to make a decision, he's immobilized by his own anxiety, and his stomach starts hurting. He experiences precisely what Sartre says about freedom. It is a burden to us. Freedom is not a source of our existential commitment and ultimate fulfillment like Kierkegaard would have it. In a sense, we are condemned by our freedom, precisely as Sartre says. That is what Chidi is the living embodiment of. So later on in the series, when several of the characters start professing their love for Chidi, so this happens with Eleanor, it happens to Tahani, it happens to the real Eleanor, so a third character, And Chidi is just destroyed by this. He can't possibly this is his worst nightmare. This is the sense in which he really is living in a sort of hell and being punished for his situation. So I think the way Sartre describes bad faith, the inability for us to take responsibility for our actions and live up to the demands of freedom, he is that to a T. He is the perfect embodiment of despair in Sartre's existential philosophy. Let me give you just a few of my favorite Chidi lines. This is the way in which Chidi is so out of touch with his own responsibility when he is told that he's actually in the bad place and he is damned. All along he's been thinking that he's in the good place. He's on his moral high horse. When he learns he's in the bad place, the best he can come up with is this explanation like, oh no, now I understand why I'm here. I once read this article about growing almonds and how bad it was for the environment, and I still used almond milk in my coffee. And it takes Michael to point out to him, no, that's not why you're here at all. He still can't face up to his responsibility for how his attempt to be moral and have this kind of moral purity to his actions in a very Kantian sense, if you're familiar with Kant's moral philosophy from some other classes, that he has destroyed the lives of everyone around him. So in a bunch of the other episodes, we see flashbacks to Chidi as a child who can't even pick teams on the soccer field during recess, and the kids don't actually end up ever getting to play a soccer game because he can't make a decision. Or there's this hilarious episode where one of his buddies at the university has these horrible red cowboy boots, and Chidi is plagued by the fact that he lied to him about it. And when the dude is seemingly on his deathbed, Chidi, or just recovered from surgery, Chidi tells him how he honestly feels, and it totally crushes him. So Chidi can't but be honest to the detriment of everybody around him and himself. My favorite line is when he's trying to order soup and he says this thing, just mulling the ethical ramifications of various soups is destructive for him, fills him with such anxiety that he just goes hungry and can't even eat. Okay, so I think Chidi is deeply in despair, and Sartre's existential philosophy can exactly help us understand what's gone wrong with his character. I think the character of Tahani is a little bit more complicated and harder to make sense of, but there's ways in which I think she also suffers from Sartrean bad faith. So as Eleanor says, she's the rich fraud. And as Tahani herself realizes, she is deeply corrupt in her own motivations. I think the thing that really connects with Sartre for me is the way in which she is made an other. Others judge her. She is made an object by other subjects. And this is the thing that she finds threatening and is the source of her anguish, her existential angst. Because she cannot face the fact, she has repressed all of her faults, and she cannot face the fact that she is deeply inadequate in the eyes of her parents, and therefore in her own eyes, because she has internalized the judgments of the other. And this is an integral aspect of what Sartre calls bad faith. She cannot take a kind of responsibility for making values her own and for forging her own way in the world. That's what you can do if you can accept the responsibility of freedom for Sartre. Then you are happy to be a value judger, and she can't do that. She experiences the judgments of others as the ultimate judgment on her own life and the determinant of value for her, instead of making those judgments for herself. So she, the series gets into a lot of her backstory with her parents, with this hilarious character of her sister, and we see it really briefly in flashbacks in these episodes that you watched. Let me say that Jason is a bit of an enigma. I think there's two ways of reading Jason's character. So I think you could say in Kierkegaard's universe that Jason actually has no self. He is just portrayed as the bumbling idiot, or as Eleanor says, the idiot DJ. He's a bumbling criminal who died because he asphyxiated in a safe wearing a snorkel, not realizing that he wouldn't be able to breathe with that thing. The snorkel doesn't go out of the safe. He is just inside, closed in the safe with a snorkel, and suffocates. He's also a drug dealer. So I think there's ways in which he is so foolish, and he's portrayed as such a dunce that you might say he doesn't even have a self in the Kierkegaardian sense. He has no conception of morality, seemingly. And even when Eleanor, has this deep insight that they're actually all in hell already, he doesn't want to go to the real bad place. He wants to just act selfishly. So you might say he has no sense of morality. But I actually think this is wrong. I think that he has no awareness of self, but deeply repressed within him, he does have a sense of humanity. And we see this, I think we see the seeds of this early on with his friendship with Pillboy. And we don't see that at all in these episodes, but this is a big part of his backstory in season 1. And also, we see it in the connection that he forges with Janet, who ironically, she is not a human, but nonetheless, we see both of their humanity because of this relationship. So this is the sense in which I actually think there is a lot of depth to his character, even though it's not sitting there on the surface like the others. Now, let me say what happens next to these characters. So I said that Eleanor is the person at the beginning of the series who we see the action from, and she knows she doesn't belong here. It's a case of mistaken identity. But she doesn't just turn herself in. She wants to forge her place there. She wants to stay in the good place if she can. So what she's going to do is going to try to earn her place in there, and she enlists Chidi. In fact, she does something perfectly Eleanor-like. She tricks him. She acts completely selfishly and gets him to promise never to betray her. Of course, Chidi, the person on, the Kantian moral philosopher, can't possibly then go back on his promise. So he's like in this ethical bind because of what he said to her, forced to try to help her, even though it crushes him and fills him with existential anxiety. But nonetheless, Eleanor is going to try to make a go for it. And so a lot of the first season is seeing her attempts at earning her place in her spot in the good place. We also get this tiny little foreshadowing. So you might have seen where it's going from episode 1, because she has this moment where she's talking about her parents, and she says, oh, I was an only child, and I had horrible parents. They hated each other. She says, actually, they're probably in the good place or in the bad place if they're dead. And wait a minute, they could be used to torture each other. So already she's got a bit of an insight, like Ine, into how torture might work in the bad place. And we have no inkling of this now, the first time you've seen the series, that this is actually quite a bit of foreshadowing as to what's happening with these characters here. So just like in Sartre's play, what each of these characters is, they are actually in the bad place. They are in hell. Unlike Sartre, they don't know it. But nonetheless, as Michael says, what we've done is we've designed this experiment so that these people would actually perfectly make each other miserable. So this is just like the kind of Sartrean triangle or Sartrean square that happens in No Exit. And near episode, some part in episode 13, we actually see Eleanor figure this out and talk about how everybody is really unwittingly been torturing each other. She says, this is the perfect hell for me because I'm surrounded by people who are better than me, and that's what makes me so angry and makes me feel so inadequate. She says, Chidi is tortured by everybody else, most directly by Eleanor because she's tricked him into helping her and he can't possibly go back on it. But the way in which everybody else tortures Eleanor then indirectly tortures Chidi as well. Tahani, Eleanor, the real Eleanor, torture him in his indecisiveness. In the middle of this season, Michael forces Chidi to do something with himself, to pick up a hobby, and we start to see the seeds of his undoing in those episodes when his character gets more runtime. So that's one of the ways in which Chidi. This is perfect hell for Chidi. This is perfect hell for Jason too. Tahani is trying to get him out of his shell. She needs somebody to provide her acknowledgement, just like Estelle, and he won't do it because, in a sense, he doesn't want to blow his cover and show that he doesn't belong there. And then lastly, Tahani. This arrow is wrong. Tahani is tortured by everybody as well. I mean, most directly, Jason and Chidi, because she needs acknowledgement from them and she can't get it. She also wants a kind of acknowledgement from Eleanor, and in ways we'll see that at a certain point they start to get it, that kind of acknowledgement from each other, and this is one of the key turning points in the series. So what we learn in episode 13 is that Eleanor figures it out, just like Ine. She says they can't bring us to the bad place because we're already here. And then this is when Michael, finally blows his cover. We see him for the first time for the demon that he is, and he says, you really suck, Eleanor, because she figured it out and she completely foiled his plans. Now, what does this mean for their salvation or for authenticity, for them being saved in the bad place? Well, I'll discuss their ethical, their existential successes in a separate video. Thanks.